"You're wasting your time with that stray Mira. Dogs like him don't belong here." The words shot through the silence of the small courtyard like a stone against glass. It was Aaron, her landlord, his voice sharp and impatient, his shadow stretching across the cracked tiles of the compound. Mira tightened her grip on the laundry basket she carried, her eyes dropping toward the corner where the dog lay. He was curled up on a pile of discarded clothes, their faded colors dulled by dust, as though they had been waiting for him all along. The creature barely flinched at Aaron's scolding. His ribs rose and fell in slow, tired breaths, his ears twitching faintly when Mira's footsteps came closer. She had seen strays before, plenty of them roaming the city streets, but there was something unsettling in the stillness of this one. He did not beg, he did not bark, and he did not even attempt to leave when someone approached. He simply stayed, waiting. "Do you know how long he's been there?" Arun spat on the ground and shook his head. 3 days, 3 nights. Same place. Like a curse. "You should throw those rags out before the whole neighborhood stinks." Mira ignored him. She bent lower, studying the animal's face. His fur was once white, now browned with dirt, patches of skin showing where hair had fallen away. His eyes were half-lidded, but beneath the cloudiness she caught a glimmer of something that unsettled her more than his frailty. Recognition. "You're not just lost, are you?" she whispered. The dog shifted faintly, his paw pressing deeper into the worn fabric beneath him. Mira noticed a detail she hadn't before. The clothes he lay upon weren't just random discards. They were carefully folded, though old, as though someone had placed them there deliberately. A faded kurta, a torn scarf, a jacket with a broken zipper. Human clothes. Worn, lived in, carrying scents of a life long gone. Aaron grumbled and stormed off, muttering about stupid women and their pity. But Mira stayed, kneeling now, her hand hovering just above the dog's trembling body. He didn't shrink back. He didn't growl. Instead, his eyes flicked toward the gate at the far end of the compound. It was quick, barely noticeable, but Mira caught it, the way he looked beyond her, toward the empty space where no one stood. That night, as Mira folded her own laundry, she kept glancing out the window. The dog hadn't moved. Rain began to fall in steady drops, tapping on the tin roof. She expected him to seek shelter, to crawl under the steps or wedge himself against the wall. But he didn't. He lay there, soaking, his body trembling, but his gaze fixed firmly on that same gate. By morning, Mira couldn't help herself. She brought a small bowl of milk and an old blanket. As she placed them near him, she whispered, "What are you waiting for?" Her voice cracked as though asking the question demanded something from her, too. The dog sniffed the milk but didn't drink. He shifted slightly, revealing something tucked beneath his paw. Mira leaned closer and her chest tightened. It was a sandal. Not new, not whole, but clearly loved once. Its strap was frayed, its leather softened from long use. Her mind began to race. Clothes. A sandal. A dog that refused to leave. He wasn't guarding scraps. He was clinging to someone's memory. Neighbors began to talk. An old woman passing by said she remembered a man who used to sit in that courtyard, a man with a limp and a crooked smile. "Always wore that jacket," the woman murmured, pointing to the pile. "Fed this dog from his own plate." She shook her head as if unwilling to say more and shuffled away. Mira stood frozen. The air around her thickened with a heaviness she couldn't explain. She turned back to the dog, who still hadn't touched the milk. His eyes followed every sound of footsteps on the street outside, every creak of the gate. He was waiting, Mira realized. Not for food, not for kindness, but for the one person who would never return. And in that moment, with the drizzle softening the morning light, Mira's heart cracked at the sight of him. Not because he was broken, but because he still believed. Even in hunger, in cold, in loneliness, he held on to a hope the world had already buried. Mira pressed her palm against her mouth, silencing the sob that threatened to escape. For the first time in years, she saw herself in something other than her own reflection. A creature holding on, unable to accept that some doors close forever. And yet, there he was, faithful, patient, waiting. She whispered into the emptiness, "Whoever you're waiting for, I wish they knew what you've given them." The dog didn't stir. His gaze remained on the gate, as though the world behind it still held everything he had ever loved. Aaron's threats grew louder over the next few days. He warned Mira that if she kept feeding the dog, he would raise her rent. But it wasn't food that bound her to the creature. It was his silence, his refusal to move from that pile of clothes, his unblinking devotion to a gate that never opened. Mira found herself drawn to him in ways she couldn't explain. She would sit nearby in the evenings pretending to sew, but her eyes often lingered on him, watching the subtle shifts in his breathing, the faint twitches when distant footsteps echoed. He never flinched, never wagged his tail, never chased the sounds. He only waited. One evening, Mira noticed something unusual. As she placed water beside him, her hand brushed against the folded scarf in the pile. It was stiff, hardened from rain and dust, but when she lifted it slightly, a small photograph slipped out from beneath it. She froze. The picture, though blurred and creased, showed a man with a tired smile, crouching beside the very same dog. The jacket in the photograph was unmistakable. It was the one the animal now guarded. Mira's chest tightened as realization struck. These weren't random clothes. They were relics of a life once shared. The discovery haunted her. At night, she lay awake thinking about the man in the photo. Who was he? Where had he gone? The old woman's words echoed. Fed this dog from his own plate. Mira wanted to believe the man had simply moved away, but the weight in the dog's eyes suggested otherwise. He wasn't waiting for someone who was late. He was waiting for someone who was never coming back. By the fourth day, whispers spread across the neighborhood. Some said the man had died suddenly, collapsing on the very street outside the gate. Others claimed he had been taken away by distant relatives, leaving the dog behind. No one seemed to know for sure, yet everyone agreed on one thing. The dog had not left that spot since. Mira tried to push away the thought, but the image of him pressing his nose into the jacket, inhaling a scent long faded, shattered her every time. Then came the twist she hadn't expected. One afternoon, while Mira was hanging laundry, she noticed Arun standing stiffly near the gate, his face pale. The dog had finally moved. Not far, but enough to press his head against the metal bars, staring out at something. Mira followed his gaze and saw a figure in the distance, a boy dragging his school bag along the road. Her breath caught when the boy slowed, staring curiously at the dog. The animal's tail gave a single, faint wag, the first Mira had ever seen. Aaron's jaw clenched. He muttered something under his breath, turned sharply, and began to walk away. Mira caught his wrist. "What do you know?" she demanded. His eyes flickered with something between anger and grief. For a moment she thought he might strike her, but instead his voice dropped to a ragged whisper. "He was my brother." The words punched the air from her lungs. Arun refused to look at her, staring instead at the ground. He wouldn't listen. He wasted everything, his time, his strength, on that dog, said it was his only family, and then, one morning, he was gone. Heart gave out, right there in the street. His hands trembled, though his voice hardened again. I burned what I could, but the dog, he wouldn't let go. He dragged those clothes back one by one and made them his bed. I couldn't stop him. Mira's throat tightened. The bitterness in Aaron's tone wasn't born of cruelty. It was grief, twisted into anger. She looked back at the dog who still leaned against the gate, his eyes fixed on the boy who had long since disappeared down the road. That flicker of hope, that small wag of the tail, tore at her. The nights grew colder, and Mira worried the dog wouldn't survive much longer. She begged Aaron to let her take him in, but he refused. "If you care so much, you'll only hurt yourself," he snapped. "He's waiting for a ghost. He'll never be yours." His words cut deep, because part of her knew they were true. The dog's loyalty was unshakable, rooted in a bond death itself had failed to sever. Yet Mira couldn't walk away. She brought him food, though he barely touched it, preferring instead to rest his muzzle on that sandal or curl deeper into the jacket. Sometimes she swore she heard faint whimpers at night, soft cries swallowed by the dark. She would sit by the window, listening, wishing she could do more than witness his sorrow. And then, one evening, as the sun bled orange across the horizon, the dog lifted his head. His ears pricked, his eyes widened, and for a fleeting moment, he looked alive again. He rose shakily to his feet, his gaze locked on the gate, his tail moving in slow, uncertain arcs. Mira held her breath, sensing something shift in the air, as though the courtyard itself was bracing for what came next. The waiting was no longer just his. It had become hers, too. The third day came with a silence that felt unnatural, as though the courtyard itself was holding its breath. Mira had grown used to the faint sounds of the strays shifting on the pile, of clothes, his restless breathing filling the space between her own thoughts. But that morning, when she stepped outside, he lay utterly still, his body trembling only when he exhaled. Panic shot through her veins, and she dropped the basket of vegetables she carried, rushing toward him before she could stop herself. His eyes opened slowly, cloudy but still sharp enough to find hers, and in them Mira saw a desperate plea. She pulled the blanket tighter around him, her voice breaking as she said, "Don't give up now. Not like this." Her words startled her. Since when had she begun speaking to him as though he were not just a stray, but someone she could not afford to lose? She touched his paw and again felt the weight of the sandal tucked beneath it. He had kept it dry, tucked away even as the rain poured. That single act tore something inside her, for it revealed a truth too raw to dismiss. He wasn't just waiting for anyone. He was waiting for someone he loved, someone who had been his entire world. That afternoon, she found herself walking through the neighborhood, asking questions she never imagined she would dare. Some ignored her, others gave vague responses, until finally she reached a tea stall on the corner. The stall owner, a wiry man named Rafik, glanced at her nervously when she mentioned the dog. After a long silence, he said, "That dog belonged to Anwar. You must have seen him. Thin man, bad leg, sold second-hand books by the bus stop. He lived alone, but he never walked without that dog by his side." Mira swallowed hard. She had seen him, she realized, a man with a limp who always carried a bundle of books tied with string. She remembered his voice calling out the names of poets and novelists, trying to tempt students passing by. She had never noticed the dog then, never cared enough to look closer. Rafik's face darkened as he added, "Anwar collapsed 2 weeks ago. Heart attack. Died before they could even get him to the hospital. The dog was there, howling at the ambulance door. They buried Anwar quickly. Since then, the animal hasn't moved from that spot. He thinks his master will come back." The words struck Mira like a blow. Suddenly, the pieces fell into place. The pile of clothes, the sandal, the way the dog's gaze never left the gate. He was not a stray at all. He was a guardian of memory, a creature clinging to the last trace of love he understood. Mira returned. Home, her chest aching with the heaviness of the story she now carried. As she approached the courtyard, she paused. The dog had lifted his head despite his weakness, ears pricked as though he had heard something. His eyes, dim as they were, shone with a fragile spark. Mira turned instinctively toward the gate, but no one was there. The sight hollowed her out. He was still waiting, still believing in the impossible. She knelt beside him, unable to stop her tears. "He's not coming back," she whispered, though the words burned in her throat. "But I am here." The dog didn't understand, or maybe he chose not to. His gaze stayed fixed on the gate, unwavering, unbroken. That night, Mira dreamed of a man she barely remembered, her own father, who had left when she was 8 years old. She recalled sitting by the door with her small hands clutched around, a toy he had given her, waiting every day, convinced he would walk back in. Years later, she had learned he had built a new life elsewhere, but the child inside her had never truly stopped waiting. The parallel was cruel. The dog and she were not so different, two beings who had built their existence around absences. When morning came, Mira decided she could no longer just watch. She brought a bowl of rice soaked in broth, setting it down gently. This time he sniffed, then took a small bite. Relief flooded her as she whispered, "That's it, good boy." Yet, as he ate, his eyes never left the gate. Even as sustenance filled his belly, hope fed his soul. And then came the sound that twisted the morning into something Mira could never forget. A shuffle of footsteps outside the courtyard, followed by a voice calling a name she did not catch. The dog jerked upright with the strength she thought he had lost. His ears pricked, his tail trembled, and he let out a soft, broken whine. Mira turned toward the gate, her heart racing, unsure whether it was another neighbor, a stranger, or something else entirely. The dog staggered to his feet, the sandal clutched in his jaw, his body swaying but his spirit suddenly alive. Mira felt her breath catch. Whether or not the figure outside had any connection to his past, in that moment he believed. And that belief, raw and trembling, was both the most beautiful and the most devastating thing Mira had ever witnessed. Mira's nights grew restless, haunted by the image of the dog curled against those clothes, rain dripping from his matted fur, his body shivering yet refusing to move. She tried to focus on her work at the clinic, on the endless stream of patients and paperwork, but every time the front gate creaked open, her mind replayed that courtyard scene. It wasn't pity that gripped her. It was something deeper, something unexplainable, as though the dog's silent vigil had rooted itself inside her chest. On the fourth evening, just as dusk pressed shadows across the cracked courtyard, Mira carried a small packet of bread rolls tucked under her shawl. She found him exactly where she had left him, unmoved, his ribs rising and falling in uneven rhythm. She crouched and placed the food near him. Again, he ignored it, but this time, when the wind rattled the iron gate, his head jerked upward, ears trembling, eyes fixed in a sudden flare of recognition. Mira followed his gaze, her pulse racing. The gate swung open slowly, but no one entered. It was only the wind. The dog whimpered, low and broken, and laid his head back down. The sound pierced through Mira like a blade. It wasn't just longing, it was grief. That night, a new unease stirred in her. She remembered the old woman's words about the man with the limp and the crooked smile who used to sit there. She asked around the neighborhood, carefully weaving her questions so Aaron wouldn't hear and dismiss her as foolish. Piece by piece, she gathered fragments of a story. The man's name had been Farid. He was a cobbler, known for repairing sandals and shoes by the roadside. Quiet, gentle, always with the dog at his feet. They had been inseparable, the kind of pair people noticed because of their constancy. And then, weeks ago, Farid had collapsed on the road, his weak heart finally giving in. No family claimed him. He was buried quickly, cheaply, forgotten by most. Everyone but the dog. When Mira returned to the courtyard the following morning, she studied the pile of clothes more carefully. She hadn't noticed before how carefully they were arranged. The jacket folded, the scarf draped, the kurta placed as though waiting for its owner to slip it back on. At the center, always, the sandal tucked beneath the dog's paw. It was a shrine of sorts, not made by human hands but by loyalty itself. Mira felt the truth twist inside her. The dog wasn't simply waiting. He was keeping vigil over what remained of Farid, guarding the last traces of his scent, his touch, his memory. The realization was almost unbearable. Mira sat beside him, close enough that her knees brushed the damp fabric. "He isn't coming back," she whispered, her throat raw, but the dog's eyes didn't shift. He was locked in his faith, untouchable by reason. For a moment, Mira envied him. She, too, had lived her life waiting, for letters that never arrived, for apologies never spoken, for people who promised to return but vanished instead. She thought she had outgrown that kind of hope, but seeing it burning so fiercely in an animal made her question whether she had ever truly let go. Aaron's voice cut through her reflection, harsh and impatient as always. "Are you still feeding that cursed creature? People are saying he brings misfortune, clinging to death like that. Throw him out before the neighbors complain." Mira turned her face away, refusing to let Arun's bitterness pollute the fragile silence between her and the dog. But Aaron's words planted a seed of dread in her mind. What if one day, when she was at work, he forced the dog out, scattering the clothes, breaking the vigil? The thought made her chest constrict painfully. The days blurred into one another, a strange rhythm of watching and waiting. Mira noticed small changes. His breaths grew shallower, his movements slower, his bones more pronounced. He was fading, yet his gaze never wavered from that gate. Suspense coiled in her every evening when she came home, her heart quickening at the sight of his still form. Would tonight be the night he finally rose? Would someone appear at the gate? The uncertainty gnawed at her, even though reason told her the ending was inevitable. Then came the twist Mira hadn't expected. One evening, as she approached with a bowl of broth, she saw something different. The dog wasn't lying down. He was sitting upright, alert, his body trembling but his eyes alive in a way she hadn't seen before. His ears perked, his gaze sharp, and for the first time he let out a faint wag of his tail. Mira froze. She followed his line of sight to the gate. A figure stood there. It was not Farid. It was a boy, no older than 12, barefoot, with dust on his face and eyes that carried both fear and recognition. He clutched the gate nervously, as though unsure if he was allowed to enter. When the dog whimpered again, the boy's expression cracked and tears streamed down his cheeks. Mira's breath caught. The boy stepped forward, reaching out a trembling hand. In that instant, the dog staggered to his feet, every bone protesting, but his spirit ignited. He stumbled toward the boy, collapsing halfway, yet dragging himself with desperate strength. Mira's chest ached as she realized the truth. The dog hadn't been waiting for Farid alone. He had been waiting for the one who would carry Farid's memory forward. Someone who shared his scent, his blood, his heart. The boy dropped to his knees, clutching the dog, burying his face into the tangle of fur and damp clothes. The animal gave a low, contented sigh as though at last the vigil had ended. Mira turned away, tears slipping silently down her cheeks, the courtyard echoing with the soft reunion of grief, love, and something achingly eternal. The courtyard felt different that evening, as though the air itself had softened. Mira stood back, her hands trembling, watching the boy cradle the weary dog. The animal pressed his frail body against the child, his tail moving in small, weak arcs, but his eyes glowed with a light Mira hadn't seen before. It was the look of a soul that had finally found what it had been waiting for. The boy whispered into his fur, words too quiet to catch, but Mira could feel the weight of them. Apologies, promises, maybe even recognition of the bond they both had lost with Farid. For the first time, the dog ate. Not much, just a few soaked crumbs Mira had left nearby, but enough to show he had let go of his vigil. He no longer guarded the pile of clothes with stubborn faith. Instead, he leaned into the warmth of the boy's arms, as if surrendering to the truth that memory didn't need a gate or a pile of rags to stay alive. It could live in another heartbeat, in another pair of eyes. Mira felt her own grief stir, not for the dog, not even for Farid, but for herself. She had lived years shackled to silences and unfinished chapters, afraid to move forward, yet here was this creature teaching her what acceptance looked like. Waiting was love, yes, but letting go was love too. And sometimes, the world was merciful enough to give us someone else to carry what we couldn't. As dusk fell, the boy gathered the clothes into his small arms, piece by piece with the dog nestled close beside him. Mira knew the vigil was ending, not in despair, but in quiet fulfillment. The gate no longer looked empty. It looked like passage. She pressed her palms together, whispering a silent prayer, not for miracles but for strength, to believe, as the dog had believed, that love never truly leaves us. It only changes form, and when the gate closed behind them, Mira realized the lesson was not in the waiting, but in the courage to trust that someone, somewhere will always come, not to replace what was lost, but to keep its memory alive.